The council ring hung in space like a great silver wheel slowly turning. It was old, far older than any human ship, and it had been built by species who had been traveling between stars long before the first human being had ever looked up at the sky and wondered what was out there. It was called Council Prime, and it was the most important place in the known galaxy, or so the 39 species who sat inside it believed. Ambassador Nathaniel Cross had been inside Council Prime 3 times before this visit. The first time, 20 years ago, he had been a junior aide carrying folders for a man named Director Warren, who was now long retired and living quietly in Colorado. The second and third times he had come as a full ambassador, representing Earth in routine trade discussions that had gone nowhere and meant little. But this time was different. This time, Earth had something real to ask for. He stood near the wide observation window of the delegation quarters, looking out at the stars. His jacket was pressed and dark blue, the small Earth flag stitched neatly on the shoulder. He was a tall man, a little heavy in the middle now, with gray at his temples and a face that had spent too many years in meeting rooms. People who met him often thought he looked tired. He was not tired. He was patient. There was a difference. Claire Donovan came up beside him with 2 cups of coffee. She was 38, 12 years younger than Nathaniel, with short dark hair and the kind of posture that came from years in the Navy. She had transferred to the diplomatic corps 4 years ago, and she was better at this work than most people who had done it their whole lives. She handed him a cup without saying anything. He took it. They both looked out at the stars. "Full chamber today," she said. "I counted delegation banners from at least 32 species when we came in." "They all want to watch the renewal vote," Nathaniel said. "It only happens every 20 years. It is the biggest event on the calendar." "And we are presenting right before the vote," Claire said. "Yes," he said, "right where they put everyone they are not worried about." She looked at him. He drank his coffee and said nothing more. The great deliberation chamber of Council Prime was a vast circular room, wide enough to land a small aircraft inside. The seating rose in rings from a central floor where speakers stood, and the rings were filled with the delegations of dozens of worlds, bodies of all sizes and colors and shapes, some in suits, some in robes, some in environmental casings that hummed quietly and filled the air with strange smells. It was a room that had seen thousands of years of history. The walls carried the names of every treaty ever signed inside it, carved into the stone in scripts from 40 languages. Nathaniel and Claire took their place at the speaker's floor when their name was called. Nathaniel set his data pad on the small stand in front of him and looked out at the chamber. Hundreds of eyes, and several organs that were not eyes but served the same purpose, looked back at him. He spoke clearly and without rushing. He laid out Earth's case for expanded resource access in the outer veil, a region of space rich in rare isotopes that no species currently had a claim on. He explained the science. He explained the legal precedent under existing treaty law. He explained what Earth would offer in exchange: increased navigational data sharing, expanded medical compound exports, a longer commitment period than any previous agreement. His voice was steady. Claire stood beside him with the secondary display, ready to bring up supporting charts at the right moments. For the first few minutes, the chamber was quiet. Professional, the way it was supposed to be. Then the Vorath section began to murmur. The Vorath were tall beings, their skin faintly luminescent, shifting between pale blue and green as their moods changed. They held 5 of the 30 seats on the inner committee, more than any other single species, and they had held those seats for longer than Earth had been a member of the Accord. They were not cruel exactly. They simply did not think much of younger species, and they were not careful about hiding it. The murmuring grew. Then one of the Vorath delegates, a senior figure named Counselor Veth, whose name Nathaniel had seen in briefing documents for years, raised a hand and activated the chamber's open-floor projection system without asking the moderator for permission. A hologram appeared above the central floor, large enough for the entire chamber to see. It showed a human figure, small and stumbling, reaching up toward a shelf it could not reach. The label below the figure read, "Outer Veil Petition, Year 41 of Earth Membership." The chamber filled with sound. Not all of it was laughter, but enough of it was. Nathaniel did not move. And he stood at the stand with his hands resting on either side of the data pad and watched the hologram. It ran for about 20 seconds. Then another one appeared beside it, this one showing a cartoon of a primitive campfire with a small human sitting next to it, looking up at a sky full of alien ships with wide, frightened eyes. The label on this one read, "Earth's Strategic Contribution to the Accord." More sound from the chamber, louder this time. Elder Gress of the Storie sat in the moderator's chair at the top of the central platform. He was old and gray and had run these sessions for 30 years. He watched the holograms. He watched the chamber laugh. He did not lift his gavel. He did not say a word. Claire felt her jaw tighten. She kept her eyes on Nathaniel. His face had not changed. His breathing had not changed. And he was looking at the chamber the way a man looks at rain through a window. Not angry, not hurt, just watching something happen that he cannot stop. A third hologram appeared. This one was more elaborate, a full animated scene of a small human delegation presenting a petition to a room of towering alien species who were all looking at each other with expressions of exaggerated confusion, as though they could not understand what they were being shown. The human figures in the animation were drawn small and soft, like children in a cartoon. The alien figures were drawn with sharp, clean lines, the way you draw something important. Nathaniel watched it for a moment. Then he reached out and closed his data pad. The soft click of it was the only sound he made. He looked at Elder Gress, who was still sitting with his hands folded and his gavel untouched. He looked at Counselor Veth, who was watching the hologram with a faint smile. He looked at the chamber, at all those rings of faces. Then he said, in a voice that was calm and clear and carried easily across the room, "Earth thanks the Council for its time." He picked up his data pad. He turned around. He walked toward the exit. Claire was already moving beside him, her steps even and unhurried, her eyes straight ahead. Behind them, the laughter continued. The holograms kept playing. No one called them back. No one apologized. The moderator's gavel stayed where it was. They stepped through the chamber doors and into the corridor outside, and the sound of the laughter followed them for a few seconds before the doors sealed shut, and there was only silence. Claire looked at Nathaniel. His face was the same as it had been inside, steady, patient. But she had worked with him long enough to know what was sitting underneath that steadiness, the way you know a fire is burning even when you cannot see the flames. "They broadcast it live," she said quietly. "Every channel, every world in the Accord watched that." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Back home, too." "Yes," he said again. They stood in the corridor for a moment, the two of them, while the most important political meeting in the galaxy continued without them on the other side of the door. Then Nathaniel Cross straightened his jacket, tucked his datapad under his arm, and started walking toward the transport bay. Claire fell into step beside him. Neither of them looked back. The footage reached Earth in under 3 seconds. But that was the speed of the relay network, the same network that Earth had helped build and maintain for the past 19 years. The irony of that was not lost on the people who were watching their screens when the holograms appeared above the council floor and the laughter started. In New York, a woman eating breakfast at a small table by her window saw the cartoon human figure on the morning news and stopped chewing. In Nairobi, a group of engineers finishing a night shift in a relay station watched the broadcast on a wall screen and did not speak for a long time after it ended. In Beijing, in London, in Sao Paulo, in hundreds of cities and towns and villages, people watched Ambassador Nathaniel Cross close his datapad and walk out of the council chamber. And they felt something shift inside them that they could not quite name, but understood very well. By the time the clip had been watched 2 billion times, Secretary General Diane Hartwell was already in her car on the way to the Geneva Coordination Center. She had been awake since the early hours when her communications director had knocked on her bedroom door and told her what was happening. She had dressed quickly, said very little, and left the residence before the sun was fully up. Diane was 54 years old. A small woman with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had been Secretary General for 6 years, elected on a platform of cautious, steady diplomacy. She believed in the Accord. She had believed in it for most of her career. She was still thinking about whether she believed in it now as her car pulled into the underground entrance of the Coordination Center and the heavy doors closed behind her. The emergency session of the Unified Earth Council convened at 7 in the morning. 15 people sat around the long table in the main conference room, with more joining by secure video link from other capitals. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is carrying something heavy. Admiral Leon Price spoke first, as he often did in rooms like this. He was a broad man in his early 60s, with a Navy uniform that still sat on him the way it had 30 years ago. He had been commander of Earth's combined fleet for 4 years, and he was not a man who chose his words to make people comfortable. I have been saying for 3 years that we were sitting in a bad position, he said. Not because we are weak. We are not weak. We have been sitting in a bad position because we act like we are grateful to be in the room. And when you act like you are grateful to be in the room, people will eventually treat you like you should be. He opened a folder on the table in front of him. It was thick, printed on physical paper, the kind of document that someone had put real time into. This is a strategic assessment that my office completed 14 months ago. It has been sitting in the archive because no one wanted to make the political decision that reading it would require. I am asking this council to read it today. Secretary of Interstellar Affairs Priya Osei leaned forward. She was lean and precise in the way that people are when they have spent their careers in institutions that reward precision. She was not easily rattled, but she had watched the broadcast that morning, and something behind her eyes was different from usual. Leon, she said carefully, I understand the feeling in this room. I share it. But pulling out of 31 active treaties is not a feeling. It is a decision with consequences that will run for decades. If we close the door on the Accord, we close it on trade routes, on legal protections, on medical exchange agreements that affect real people right now. I am not saying we go to war, Leon said. I am saying we stop pretending the relationship is something it is not. The debate went for 2.5 hours. Voices rose and then came back down. Diane sat at the head of the table and listened to all of it. She asked questions. She took notes on a small paper pad. Old habit. She did not tell anyone what she was thinking. It was near the end of the second hour when the door opened and a young man came in quietly and placed a document on the table near Diane's right hand. He did not interrupt the conversation that was happening. He just set it down and stepped back toward the wall. His name was Cole Warner. He was 29 years old, and he worked in the Strategic Analysis Office 3 floors below the conference room. He was not senior enough to be in this meeting. He had been allowed in because Diane's chief of staff, knowing what Cole had been working on for the past 8 months, had quietly cleared his access that morning before anyone else was awake. The document was 70 pages long. Its title was simple: Earth's Structural Position in the Interstellar Economy, a Full Audit. Diane looked at the cover. She looked at Cole, standing quietly against the wall. He gave a small, respectful nod. She set the document beside her and kept listening to the debate. The session ended without a decision. People went to get food and use the bathroom and make calls. Diane stayed at the table. She picked up Cole's document and began reading. The numbers inside it were not dramatic. They were methodical. Page by page, Cole had traced every significant point where the galactic economy touched human output. The transit corridors that ran through Earth-registered space. The biological compounds that only Earth's particular ecosystem produced. Or the precision-manufactured components that 3 alien industrial bases depended on because building the factories to make them locally would take decades. He had not written the document to be angry. He had written it the way an engineer documents a bridge, to show exactly what is holding what up. What it showed was that a very large number of galactic economic systems had quietly grown dependent on Earth without anyone, including, it seemed, most of Earth's own government, fully realizing it. Earth had been so focused on fitting into the Accord that it had never stopped to look at how much of the Accord was, in fact, resting on Earth's shoulders. Diane read the whole document. It took her until just past midnight. When she finished, she sat alone in the empty conference room for a while, looking at the far wall. She was not angry. Exactly. She was something colder and more useful than angry. She was clear. She called her chief of staff at midnight and asked for one piece of paper. A single executive order template. She wrote it herself in about 10 minutes. It was not long. It did not need to be long. It said that, effective in 72 hours, Earth would suspend its active obligations under all 31 current interstellar treaties, pending a full review of terms. She signed it. She dated it. She set it on the table. Then she went to find Cole Warner, who was still in his office 3 floors below, working on a follow-up section that nobody had asked him for. She knocked on his open door. He looked up, startled, clearly not expecting the Secretary General to be standing there in the middle of the night. "Your document," she said. Yes," he said. "Good work," she said. "Get some sleep." She went back upstairs. The executive order was sent to the communications office at 1 in the morning, with instructions to release it at 6. By the time most of Earth woke up that day, the message was already traveling outward at the speed of the relay network, the same network Earth had spent 19 years helping to build, toward every world in the Accord. 72 hours. Then the door would close. The 72 hours passed the way a held breath passes, slowly, and then all at once. There was no announcement when the moment came. No speech, no ceremony. At the exact time written in the executive order, a series of automated processes that the Earth Coordination Office had been preparing quietly for 3 days simply ran. The relay stations that had been forwarding interstellar trade data stopped forwarding it. Navigational beacons in 3 contested transit corridors that passed through Earth-registered space went dark, one after another, in a sequence so orderly it almost sounded like music. Outbound shipping manifests for Pharmacynth 9, the human-derived biological compound used in 2 alien species' most common medical procedures, were placed on indefinite administrative hold. No hostile act, no declaration, just a door, closing. On Earth, most people went about their morning. They made coffee and took their children to school, and argued about small things and looked at the sky, which looked the same as it always had. What was happening was not visible from the ground. It was happening far out in space, in the quiet machinery of a galaxy that had, for 40 years, grown used to Earth being reliably, quietly there. The first species to notice were the Vorith, though they did not notice in the way they expected to. Counselor Veth, the same man who had authorized the satirical holograms at the council session, received a report from his government's logistics office 4 days after the treaty suspension. 3 deep space mining platforms in the outer arc, platforms that had been running continuous operations for 11 years, were showing irregular cargo scheduling. The route licenses they used to move their ore shipments through a key transit corridor were registered under Earth's navigational authority. Those licenses had been renewed automatically every 6 months for a decade. The last renewal had not come through. The platforms were not dark yet. They had reserve fuel and could keep running for a while. But the clock was running and there was no one to call, because the office that processed the renewals had posted an automated response citing treaty suspension and nothing more. Veth read the report twice. Then he set it aside and had his morning meeting and did not mention it to anyone. He was not yet ready to think about what it meant. The Cathari felt it differently and faster. Their orbital medical stations, 5 of them, positioned around 3 separate worlds, ran on a 20-week supply cycle of Pharmacynth 9. The compound treated a common chronic condition in Cathari biology, something roughly equivalent to a human autoimmune disorder. It was not fatal without treatment, but life without it was significantly harder. And the Cathari had come to depend on steady Earth exports the way you come to depend on any medicine that works. When the shipment notifications stopped arriving and the administrative hold notices started coming in, the Cathari Medical Authority filed an emergency inquiry with Earth's Coordination Office within 48 hours. The response they received was polite, brief, and said nothing useful. All outbound shipments were suspended pending treaty review, and no timeline for resolution was available at this time. Elder Gress, the Cathari Council moderator who had sat through the laughter without lifting his gavel, was the one who sent the communique to Ambassador Nathaniel Cross. He had been sending diplomatic messages for 30 years, and he was good at keeping the right tone, measured, serious, at carrying a quiet urgency without saying anything that could be read as a demand. He explained the medical situation. He noted the long relationship between the Cathari and Earth. He expressed confidence that the matter could be resolved through dialogue. Nathaniel Cross received the message at his desk in the Earth delegation quarters on Council Prime, where he and Claire had stayed to observe proceedings. He read it fully. Then he opened a new file, dated it, and logged the communique as received. Then he closed the file. He did not write a reply. He went and got a glass of water and stood by the window for a while, looking out at the stars, and then he went back to his desk and continued with the rest of his day. Claire saw him log the message without responding. She said nothing because she understood. The choice not to respond was not cruelty. It was the same choice Elder Gress had made in the council chamber. The choice to do nothing, to let something happen that should have been stopped. The Cathari had a medical situation now. Earth had had a dignity situation. Both were real. Only one of them had been treated as worth acting on. On Council Prime, the mood among the delegations shifted in a way that was hard to describe but easy to feel. It was a little like the way a crowded room changes when someone important leaves it. Nothing visible changes, but the balance is different, and everyone knows it. Several delegations sent careful, informal messages to Earth's remaining staff, noting that they had always valued the partnership and hoped for a quick resolution. And the messages were friendly and slightly anxious in a way that professional diplomatic language almost hid, but not quite. Admiral Leon Price, back on Earth, quietly repositioned 2 carrier groups in the outer veil. He did not make an announcement. There was no press release. The movements were logged in the standard navigational record, visible to anyone who looked, filed under routine patrol rotation. They were not threatening. They were simply visible, the way a large animal is visible when it stands up from where it has been sitting quietly in the grass for a long time. It was around this time that several galactic economic analysts, beings who made their living reading the numbers behind the politics, began running models they had never had cause to run before. They had always assumed Earth's role in the interstellar economy was significant but replaceable. Most things were replaceable given time and resources. What they found when they ran the models was more complicated than that. Some of Earth's contributions were replaceable, in theory, in 5 to 10 years with serious investment. Others were replaceable only in 20 or 30 years because the biology or the geography or the particular industrial history that produced them simply could not be copied quickly. And a few, including certain transit corridor licenses that ran through positions Earth had occupied for decades, were not replaceable at all without Earth's agreement, because the legal structure of the Accord itself had written Earth into the architecture in ways that nobody had thought were important when they were written. The analysts published their findings. The findings were read by governments. The governments read them quietly and did not immediately say anything in public, but several of them contacted each other in the following days in private channels, and the content of those conversations, while not public, could be reasonably guessed at. Claire Donovan sent a single message to Secretary General Diane Hartwell 3 weeks after the treaty suspension came into effect. It was short. It said, "They thought we needed them more than they needed us. We are correcting the record." She did not expect a reply and did not get one, but the next morning Diane's chief of staff sent a brief note saying that the Secretary General had read the message and passed it along to the strategic team. On Council Prime, the Councillor Veth of the Vorath received a second logistics report. The mining platforms were still running, but 2 of the 3 were reducing operations to conserve fuel. His government had been trying to find an alternative route license through a different corridor, but the only available authority to issue one in that region was, again, Earth. The file had gone to Earth's administrative office. The automated response was the same as before: suspended pending treaty review. Veth sat with the report on his desk for a long time that evening. He thought about the holograms he had authorized. He thought about the laughter in the chamber. He thought about Nathaniel Cross closing his data pad and walking out, calm as still water. He had thought at the time that the human had looked defeated. He was beginning to understand that he had been wrong about that. They arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning, which Diane Hartwell found either rude or honest, depending on how she thought about it. 11 vessels, carrying delegations from 11 different species, appearing in Earth's orbital approach lane and requesting docking clearance at the platform. No prior notice. No formal request through the usual channels. Just ships showing up, the way a neighbor shows up at the door when something has gone wrong and they do not want to give you time to prepare. Diane was told about the arrival while she was in the middle of a domestic policy meeting about water infrastructure. She listened to her communications director give the summary, thanked her, and then turned back to the infrastructure discussion and finished it. When the meeting ended 40 minutes later, she sent a brief message to the orbital platform. The delegation was welcome to dock and was free to use the guest facilities. She would be available to meet in 4 days. 4 days. The message was polite. It was also a statement, and every diplomat in those 11 ships understood it as one. They were not being turned away. They were being made to wait. In the language of interstellar diplomacy, being made to wait by the party you had come to see without an invitation was its own kind of answer to the question of who was in the stronger position. The 4 days passed. The delegation stayed on the platform, making use of the guest facilities, taking walks on the observation deck, looking down at the blue and white surface of Earth below them, as several of them had never seen Earth from orbit before. It was a small planet by galactic standards, green and wet and very much alive. A few of them, looking down at it, found themselves recalculating things they thought they had already calculated. On the morning of the 4th day, Diane Hartwell's convoy crossed the city of Nairobi and pulled up outside the new assembly hall, a wide, low building of stone and glass that had been completed 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of gathering. Nathaniel Cross was already inside when Diane arrived. He had returned from Council Prime the previous week and now sat at the back of the room in a simple observer's chair, not at the main table, not in the official delegation, just watching. His jacket was dark blue, same as always. The Earth flag on the shoulder. The alien delegations filed in and took their seats at the long, curved table that faced the front of the room. There were representatives from 11 species, including 3 that had been in the chamber during the council session and had either laughed or said nothing. They arranged themselves and their environmental equipment and their translation devices with the careful efficiency of people who had done this many times. Their postures were composed. Their expressions, where readable, were serious. Diane sat at the center of the Earth side, with Priya Ose to her left and two senior advisors to her right. Cole Warner was at the front of the room, standing beside a large display screen. He looked slightly out of place, too young for the setting, and dressed in a plain gray jacket that was not quite formal enough for the occasion. But he stood straight and did not look nervous, which was the only thing that mattered. "We appreciate the opportunity to meet," the lead Vorath representative began. His name was Delegate Harrow, not Councillor Veth, who had not come, which was itself a piece of information. Harrow was younger than Veth, his bioluminescence a steadier blue, his tone measured and professional. "We believe that the current situation has arisen from a misunderstanding, and we are hopeful that dialogue can—" "Thank you, Delegate Harrow," Diane said pleasantly. "Before we open for discussion, we have a presentation." Harrow paused. He nodded. He sat back. Cole Warner turned to his display and began. He did not perform the presentation. He was not a performer by nature. And he did not try to become one for this occasion. He simply walked through the data the way he had built it, methodically, clearly, in plain language that needed no translation to understand. He showed transit corridor maps and the licenses that controlled them. He showed economic flowcharts for Pharmosynth 9 and 6 other human-origin compounds, tracing them through the medical and industrial systems of 14 alien species. He showed the manufacturing dependency tables, the ones that identified specific components that multiple alien industries relied on and that could not be sourced elsewhere within any practical time frame. He showed the legal architecture analysis, the one that revealed how deeply Earth had been written into the structural framework of the Accord over 40 years of membership, not as a favor to Earth, but simply as a consequence of Earth reliably being there, reliably providing, reliably showing up. The presentation was 3 hours long. Nobody left. Nobody asked to take a break. At one point, a Cathari delegate asked a clarifying question about the Pharmosynth timeline, and Cole answered it with 2 slides he had prepared for exactly that question. The room was very quiet throughout. The kind of quiet that happens when people are not bored, but are, instead, very carefully taking in information that is rearranging things in their heads. Toward the end of the second hour, Delegate Harrow of the Vorath tried to reframe the situation. He did it smoothly, in the way of someone experienced at reframing. "Clearly," he said, "there are mutual dependencies here, which is exactly why it is in both our interests to resolve the current disruption through—" Priya Ose cut in before anyone else could speak. Her voice was calm and completely flat. "A misunderstanding is when both sides make an error," she said. "What happened at the council was a performance. We have simply decided to stop funding the stage." Harrow opened his mouth and then closed it again. The room stayed quiet. At the back of the room, Nathaniel Cross looked at Priya. She did not look back at him. She was looking at Delegate Harrow with the calm, steady expression of someone who has nothing left to prove and knows it. When the presentation ended, when Cole had shown the last slide and stepped back from the screen, Diane addressed the delegation directly. She was brief. "Earth has 3 requirements for the resumption of normal treaty obligations," she said. "First, a full formal apology, specifically for the events of the council session, entered permanently into the council record. Second, a restructured treaty framework that reflects Earth's actual economic contribution to the Accord, to be negotiated over the following 12 months. Third, a seat on the Inner Committee effective immediately, which Earth should have been granted 30 years ago." She folded her hands on the table. "You have 20 days to return with a response." The delegations were quiet for a moment. Then Harrow asked carefully whether the requirements were negotiable. "The deadline is not," Diane said. They filed out an hour later, back to the platform, back to their ships. The assembly hall emptied. Cole was still at the front of the room, shutting down his display. Priya was speaking quietly with one of the advisors. Diane stood near the window, looking out at the city, where cars moved through the streets and people went about their day with no idea what had just been said in this room on their behalf. At the back of the room, Nathaniel Cross stood up slowly, picked up his data pad, and walked toward the door. He did not say anything to anyone. There was nothing to say. It had already been said. The vote at the Galactic Council was held on the 19th day, one day before Diane's deadline, which was either a coincidence or a message, and Diane had long since stopped believing in coincidences where diplomacy was concerned. Claire Donovan watched the session from the observer's gallery on Council Prime. She sat alone in the second row, her hands resting on the railing, her face calm. She had not been invited to sit with the Earth delegation for the vote. There was no Earth delegation present. Diane had not sent one because sending a delegation would have implied Earth was waiting to hear the result, which would have been only half true. Earth already knew what the result would be because the numbers had made the result inevitable. But it was still important that it happen, that it be done formally and correctly and in a room full of witnesses, and so Claire was there to see it. The motion was read aloud by a new moderator. Elder Gress had announced his retirement from the position 2 weeks earlier, quietly, with no explanation offered and none required. The new moderator was a younger Sithari named Delegate Oral, but who had a reputation for keeping sessions running on time and treating all parties the same way. The motion covered 3 items: the formal apology, the restructured framework, and Earth's seat on the inner committee. The chamber voted, 31 in favor, 8 against. The 8 who voted against were the same blocks that had laughed the loudest, and everyone in the room knew it, and no one said it out loud, and it did not need to be said. When the vote was confirmed, Delegate Oral struck the gavel once and announced the result in the calm, even voice of someone completing a procedural step. In the observer's gallery, Claire let out a slow breath. Not a sigh of relief, exactly. More the breath you let out when something that was always going to happen finally does, and you can put down the weight of waiting for it. She sent one message to Diane. Done. Diane's reply came back in under a minute. It was 2 words. Good. Rest. In the days that followed, things returned to something resembling normal, though the word normal did not quite fit anymore. The transit corridor beacons came back on. The Pharmacynth 9 shipments were scheduled to resume within the week. The Voreth mining platform licenses were processed and renewed. On paper, looking only at the flow of goods and data and legal permissions, the galaxy looked mostly as it had before the treaty suspension. But everyone who worked in these systems knew it was not the same. The thing that had changed was not visible in any single document or record. It was a kind of knowledge that had entered the room and could not leave. Every species in the Accord now knew exactly what Earth had chosen not to do for 40 years, and chose to do now, and would be capable of doing again. That knowledge sat in the back of every calculation from this point forward, quiet and permanent, the way a scar sits on skin, not something you think about every moment, but something you are always aware of. On the day the formal apology was entered into the council record, Councillor Veth of the Voreth signed the document in his private office, alone. His staff had offered to arrange a formal signing ceremony, something with witnesses and a transcript. He had declined. He sat at his desk in the early morning, before anyone else in his office had arrived, and read the apology language one more time. It was correct. It was complete. It named the events of the council session directly, without softening or reframing, and it committed the council to ensuring such conduct would not occur again. He signed it. He put his pen down. He looked at the hologram equipment in the corner of his office, the same system he had used to authorize the satirical broadcasts from the council floor. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at the signed document. Then he went and made himself a cup of the hot beverage his species drank in the morning, and he stood by his window, and he did not think about anything in particular for a while. Back on Earth, Diane Hartwell held a short public address in the early afternoon. She stood at a simple podium in the courtyard of the Coordination Center, without a large stage or formal backdrop, which was a choice. Reporters and cameras filled the courtyard. On the street beyond the gate was crowded with people who had gathered without being asked to. She spoke for 4 minutes. She did not call what had happened a victory, because it was not a victory. Victories were for wars, and this had not been a war. She called it a correction. She said that Earth's patience had been generous and remained generous, and that Earth hoped the correction would not need to happen again, but that Earth would not be pretending anymore to be smaller than it was or less important than it was in order to make others comfortable. She said Earth had always done the work, had always shown up, and intended to keep doing so. But that, from now on, the terms would reflect the reality. She finished and went inside before the reporters could get their first question out. That evening, Claire Donovan landed back on Earth for the first time in 8 months. She had one bag. She did not have any meetings scheduled. She took a car to a small restaurant in the old part of Lisbon, where Nathaniel Cross was already sitting at a corner table with a glass of wine. No aides, no staff. The Earth flag pin still on his jacket lapel, even though he was entirely off duty. They ordered food and ate it and talked about things that had nothing to do with diplomacy for a while. Then Claire looked at him and asked the question she had been carrying for weeks. "Do you think it holds?" she said. "The new terms, the intercommittee seat, all of it." Nathaniel considered the question properly, the way he did with all questions, without rushing to an answer. He turned his wine glass slowly on the table. "Yes," he said, "or because the math is visible now, and math does not forget." Claire smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that had more in it than it showed. "You sound like coal," she said. Nathaniel laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere low in the chest, and Claire realized she had not heard him laugh in a long time. It sounded like something loosening. "He is not wrong," Nathaniel said. "Young people often are not." They stayed at the table for another hour. Outside the restaurant window, the city moved and breathed around them. People walking, lights in windows, a night that smelled like salt air from the water a few streets over. Ordinary life, carrying on, the way it always did, whether or not the politics of the galaxy had shifted on its axis that week. Far out in the dark, past the orbit of the outermost planet, a survey vessel named the Eleanor Gray was moving slowly through the outer veil. Its crew of 12 was awake in shifts, running scans, logging coordinates, doing the careful, methodical work of mapping a region of space that nobody had been allowed to touch until now. The isotope readings were strong, stronger than the models had predicted. The chief scientist on board, a quiet woman named Dr. Alice Ford, sat at her station in the early hours of the morning and looked at the data coming in and allowed herself, alone, a small, satisfied sound. Nobody on the Eleanor Gray was thinking about the council vote. Nobody was thinking about the holograms or the laughter or the 70 pages that had changed everything. They were just doing the work. They had always done the work. That was the thing about Earth that the galaxy had spent 40 years mistaking for weakness. It was not weakness, it was simply who they were.